Imagine this. It's the year 1816. Europe has just breathed a sigh of relief after the devastating Napoleonic Wars. People dreamed of peace, of rebuilding, of returning to normal life, but instead, they faced hell. Not just a prolonged winter, not just a crop failure, but a true end of the world. City streets are drowning in snow in June. Rivers overflow and then dry up. The sun turns red and dim, and you can look at it without averting your gaze. Chaos erupts worldwide. Famine, disease, mass migrations. Today, you'll discover how an ordinary boat trip changed world literature, why the bicycle appeared thanks to a disaster, and how an island thousands of kilometers from Europe triggered the appearance of cholera, which wiped out millions of people for 150 years. Ready? Let's go! In 1816, the Northern Hemisphere plunged into an anomalous cold. Spring never truly arrived. Snow lay on the ground until the end of May, and in some regions, it continued to fall even in June. Where meadows usually greened and gardens bloomed, snowdrifts piled high. Rivers, frozen and unable to thaw, paralyzed trade. But soon it became clear that there was nothing to transport anyway. When the snow finally stopped, continuous rains began. In Switzerland, a record 130 days of incessant downpour were recorded. And in August, when people hoped for at least some harvest, frosts hit. Crops died, livestock was slaughtered because there was nothing to feed them. People ate grass and caught ground squirrels to survive. This disaster encompassed not only Europe and America, the same thing was happening in Asia. China faced unprecedented floods that destroyed crops and doomed millions to starvation. Mass migration began. People abandoned their homes in search of a better life. But wherever they went, the same fate awaited them. All sane people believed it was a sign of the end of days, a punishment for the sins after the Napoleonic Wars. The sun was red and dim. One could look at it fearlessly, and spots were visible to the naked eye. Some scientists of that time hypothesized that the sun was burning out and ceasing to shine, causing the earth to freeze. But no one, absolutely no one, not even the most brilliant minds, could have guessed the true cause of this global cataclysm. It was hidden thousands of miles away. Get ready. What you're about to learn will turn your understanding of the planet's climate upside down. In reality, the cause of this entire nightmare was a volcanic eruption. But not in Europe or America, but on the distant Indonesian island of Sumbawa. On April 5, 1815, a year before the year without a summer, the long-dormant Mount Tambora awakened. At that moment, it was a majestic mountain, 4,200 meters high. The initial explosion was so powerful that it was heard on the island of Java, more than 1,000 kilometers from the epicenter. Most local residents, having survived the initial shock, believed the worst was over and that the volcano would now only be a picturesque spectacle illuminating the nights. How wrong they were. They had only 5 days left. On the evening of April 10, 1815, the mountain exploded. The entire summit of Tambora was effectively blown away. A third of the mountain disappeared, forming a colossal crater from which boiling lava poured. A gigantic black column of volcanic ash and smoke, 43 kilometers high, rose into the sky. Within hours, this column collapsed on the slopes of the mountain in the form of pyroclastic flows, superheated mixtures of ash, rocks, and gases, moving at the speed of a car and incinerating everything in their path. The island was transformed into an Asian Pompeii. Those who survived the explosion and the subsequent tsunami were doomed to starve to death, as all vegetation around them was destroyed. The eruption of Tambora is considered the most devastating in human history. But the most terrifying part was just beginning. How could a local explosion change the climate across the entire planet? The answer is shocking. At first glance, the disaster on Sumbawa seemed localized, but the eruption of Tambora released 60 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. This gas did not immediately settle to the ground with the ash, but rose into the stratosphere, where winds carried it across the entire northern hemisphere. Millions of tiny particles of sulfur dioxide formed a kind of screen that reflected sunlight, and the Earth began to cool. The average temperature in the northern hemisphere decreased by only 0.7 degrees Celsius. It doesn't sound impressive, but it was enough to cause climate changes on 3 continents. Prolonged winters, cold springs, and icy summers became the norm. Furthermore, the change in temperature disrupted the normal flow of air masses. In some places, like the aforementioned Switzerland, record rains began, while in others, absolute droughts. For example, in the USA, after the June snow, almost no rain fell throughout the entire summer. Thomas Jefferson, former president and successful farmer, left detailed records of that summer. He wrote that the grain harvest in the Atlantic states would barely be 1/3 of the usual, and tobacco even less. Tobacco was one of the most important export crops, and its demise meant ruin for many farmers. This led to mass migration westward, contributing to the emergence of new states such as Illinois and Indiana. But that's not all. The next consequence of this disaster would change the world forever, claiming millions of lives. In India, the cooling in the northern hemisphere led to the failure of the monsoon season. Normally in summer, temperatures rise, creating a pressure difference between land and ocean, which draws moist air masses from the ocean and causes monsoons. In 1816, this temperature difference was insufficient. A terrible drought began. But the worst happened when the rains finally did come, but only in August, after everything had dried up completely. The downpours washed away the entire fertile topsoil, which had turned to dust. After this, an unprecedented famine erupted in India. And while everything alive was dying in the parched Hindustan, cholera bacteria rapidly multiplied in the remaining water bodies. Before the 19th century, cholera was endemic to India. Epidemics regularly flared up, but did not spread beyond the subcontinent, not crossing the Himalayas. This is because cholera bacteria inhabit open freshwater bodies, and annual monsoon rains carry them into the ocean, thereby renewing the population every year. In 1816, due to the absence of monsoons, cholera bacteria found ideal conditions for multiplication. The disease struck a population already weakened by famine, and for the first time in history, cholera became a pandemic. It broke out of Hindustan, crossed the Himalayas, and by 1828 reached the Mediterranean Sea and Japan. By 1830, cholera had reached Russia and Europe, and in 1832, it crossed the Atlantic on ships to America. Throughout the second half of the 19th and the first half of the 20th century, cholera would kill millions of people worldwide. But did this year bring only suffering and death? No, it was from this hell that amazing inventions and cultural phenomena emerged, changing our lives forever. For instance, oats, a crucial grain crop of that time, used for human and horse consumption, became 7 times more expensive due to crop failure. Maintaining a horse became an unaffordable luxury even for the middle class. This prompted the German Baron Karl von Drais to invent and patent the running machine, the prototype of all modern bicycles and kick scooters. Even more astonishing cultural events unfolded. In the spring of 1816, Lord Byron, fleeing scandals and persecutions, left England and traveled to Europe, hoping to finish his poem in solitude. But fate brought him together with a company that included his casual lover, her half-sister, and the sister's boyfriend, the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, whom Byron had long admired. They rented 2 villas on the shores of Lake Geneva, planning to spend time on a boat under the moon. But the weather, as you already know, was not conducive to romance. The famous rains kept the entire company confined indoors. When all the books had been read and the wine consumed, Byron suggested, "Why don't we each write a ghost story?" Byron himself started a novella about a vampire, but abandoned it. With his permission, his personal physician, Dr. John Polidori, took the idea, reworked it, and finished the story. It was published anonymously, but Polidori actively spread rumors that it was Byron's work. And since Byron was the most famous writer in Europe, the book sold in huge numbers. Polidori's vampire became the progenitor of the entire genre of vampire stories. Without it, there would be no Bram Stoker's Dracula, no Interview with the Vampire, no Twilight, no TV series about romantic bloodsuckers. But even greater influence on world culture was exerted by a work written by one of the young women, 19-year-old Mary Godwin, who would later marry and become Mary Shelley. She penned a completely original story about a scientist who, using electricity, reanimates a body stitched together from human corpses. And this monster begins to wander the world in search of love and friendship. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein pioneered the entire genre of science fiction, became a classic of Gothic horror, and an inexhaustible source of inspiration for Halloween. So we see that even in the most terrible catastrophes, there's room for surprising turns. But are you ready to learn why even the most destructive volcano in history might actually be a salvation? The Tambora eruption is rated 7 out of 8 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index. For comparison, the 1991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines was a 6 and led to a global temperature drop of half a degree Celsius. Such eruptions occur, albeit very rarely. A magnitude 8 eruption, which would signify the awakening of a supervolcano like Yellowstone, is fortunately unlikely. Interestingly, volcanic ash, initially destructive, can be beneficial in the long run. After the much less powerful eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980, when local fields were covered with a layer of ash, they began to yield unique grain harvests a few years later. Volcanic ash contains many microelements necessary for plant nutrition. The eruption, which initially created problems, transformed the region into a grain hub of the United States a few years later. Well, that's all for today. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. This will help YouTube recommend more fascinating stories to you. We'll see you soon.